Hello, welcome back to Walton on Trent and what was going to be an introduction from Stafford Station. Unfortunately, the weather had other ideas, but I've used the time saved from not travelling to make a start on my winter break layout work. The box mock-ups and loose detail has all been tidied away, and the station is back to its bare bones again for some finessing and weathering. I've also got 24 panels of blue ceiling tiles to weather. The structure and shape of one set of stairs has really progressed, and this will soon be ready for painting and detailing, and the other two sets are well underway too. Once they're fixed in, I can finalise this whole section here, which doesn't need to be removable as I can get my hands in from either side. I've parked my Mark 3A coach project for now. It had stopped being enjoyable and was getting in the way of other things, not least some modifications and upgrades to my Helgen 86s, which are all on my workbench. There'll be a future episode on these, probably in the spring. There's still some track work to do too. Just this morning I fixed down the long siding here I call Yard 6, where the RMC train lives, and it now has digitally controlled point access. There are a couple of other points I need to tweak, where the throw isn't quite clean, and one or two lumpy bits of track to address too. Right now, let's crack on with this month's episode. It's really just one big prototype film which I've been planning and researching for about 12 months, although there have been a few hasty rewrites these past few weeks, where I had been planning to film at the locations you're about to see. Like the trains involved, this is another long one, so grab yourself a brew and some Christmassy biscuits as we take a look at Walton on Trent's coal trains. Where they came from, where they went to, and how they worked.
In South Wales, it seems over 2.5 feet thick. There is still at least 10,000 million tons of the coal that made her famous. Enough for another 400 years.
Staffordshire isn't the first county that springs to mind when you think of UK coal mining. In terms of area, the coalfield is dwarfed by the likes of South Wales, South Yorkshire or Nottinghamshire, but despite its small size it has an amazing number and variety of workable seams, and in the central area the seams are thicker than any other coalfield in England except Lancashire. It corresponds closely to the Newcastle-under-Lyme Stoke-on-Trent conurbation, also known as the Potteries, and it's not difficult to imagine how the discovery of coal underground led to the growth of industrial activity and urbanisation on the surface. Mining in the area started in the late 13th century and reached its peak during the Industrial Revolution when over 30,000 men worked nearly 400 mines of various sizes. After nationalisation in 1947, only 22 pits were left in operation. As seams became exhausted and pits were consolidated by the National Coal Board, that number was reduced further, and at the time of the 1984-85 miners' strike, only 4 pits were still open, at Woolstanton, Holditch, Silverdale and Trentham. Woolstanton mined under land owned by the Duchy of Lancaster, and the special conditions attached to its activities made it an increasingly difficult and expensive operation. It closed in 1986. Holditch was largely exhausted by the late 80s and closed in 1989. So North Staffordshire started its final decade of mining with just 2 pits, Silverdale to the west of Newcastle and Trentham to the south of Stoke. Trentham started out as Hem Heath, a relatively late arrival to the Staffordshire mining story, which began when the first shaft was sunk in the late 1920s. After nationalisation a quarter of a century later, the single shaft was seriously restricting the mine's potential output, and the second shaft was sunk in 1956. At the same time, the entire site was extensively overhauled and expanded. The modernised mine was a success, and during the 1970s, the National Coal Board decided to capitalise on its investment at Hemheath by linking it with the Florence colliery, 50 years older and 2 miles to the east. Florence had no railhead and had been tripping its output to Hemheath, which had an extensive one, by a surface mineral line. Under the merger plans, the workings and tunnels would be linked underground, and all output of the combined super pit would be extracted through the Hemheath shafts. By the late 80s, the two mines were operating under the same management and one name, Trent Colliery. It was a highly productive pit, but in 1991 the NCB classified Trentham as not required, and it last produced in October 1992. Despite protests, the mine closed 12 months later, leaving 110 million tonnes of reserve coal to be cleared. Trentham benefited from direct access to the West Coast Main Line, which formed the site's western perimeter. This section of track was built by the North Staffordshire Railway and opened in 1848 as part of the Stafford to Manchester route via Norton Bridge. 100 years later, on nationalisation, it became part of the official West Coast Main Line and is part of the primary London-Manchester route, which deviates from the core line at College Junction. Trentham Station stood here until it was closed under beaching. Its Italianate styling mirrored that of nearby Trentham Hall. In this picture from 1957, you can clearly see the brand new pit infrastructure behind it. After the development of the HAA coal wagon and MGR system in the late 60s, Trentham finally got a rapid loading bunker in 1977. Images online frequently show what must have been the colliery 08 shunter working the facility. I'm guessing that the sheer volume of coal coming out of or through Trentham meant that some MGR trains were preloaded with the shunter and then collected later by mainline locos. The loading bunker would have been about here, but the only clue today is the alignment of this trackside footpath. Zooming in suggests that some of the old rail infrastructure is still lying in the undergrowth, but there are no other remnants of this massive colliery anywhere to be seen. Attempts to preserve the giant headstocks, known locally as the Big A, as an industrial heritage monument, were thwarted when they were demolished in 1997. Today, the site is covered with mostly housing, and the street names all have a cricket theme. A couple of miles to the northwest of Newcastle town centre, Silverdale was much older than Trentham, dating back to the turn of the 18th and 19th centuries, but it really took off in the 1960s as new technology allowed the mine to reach its full potential. In the 70s, it underwent massive southwards extension to an area roughly underneath the Keele service area on the M6, and it sustained a high level of production throughout the 1980s and into the 90s. However, like Trentham, this wasn't enough to save it, and Silverdale, the last deep mine in North Staffordshire, drew its last coal under NCB ownership in December 1993. But this wasn't the end. The NCB leased the mine to a private consortium, and production resumed the following year. But it was an Indian summer for Silverdale. Exactly 5 years after the NCB pulled the plug, the mine closed again in December 1998, this time for good. Mining in Staffordshire was over. Silverdale also had direct rail access and a station, although again it closed under beaching. The line was another North Staffordshire Railway operation, this time from Stoke to Market Drayton in Shropshire, and crossing the West Coast Main Line by Overbridge, south of the village of Madeley. After World War II, passenger traffic really dwindled, but freight traffic boomed, reaching a peak in 1962 and prompting the construction of a direct access link to the West Coast Main Line, the Madeley Chord. Built in the western quadrant of the rail crossing, the new track linked the upper branch line to the slow lines of the West Coast Main Line underneath. But only a few years later, after a large dairy and railhead closed further up the tracks, freight traffic all but stopped, and in 1966 the line west of Madeley was closed. To the east, the junction at Newcastle was severed in preparation for the West Coast Main Line electrification, leaving just 5 miles of track, whose only connection to the rest of the network was the Madeley Cord, and whose only purpose was to service the colliery. As an old Victorian mine, Silverdale lacked the space of Trentham, and rail operations were tight. Empty trains would arrive via the upslow of the West Coast Main Line, crossing over the downslow to access and ascend the Madeley Cord. The old Madeley station had been rebuilt as a crew facility, there on the left. We're standing on the Manor Road Bridge, looking northeast. The train stops, the loco decouples and moves forward to the single track section beyond the points. We're now looking in the direction of Market Drayton. Points are changed, and he moves forward to run round his train. In this combination of 3 films, another train is already exiting the colliery. So let's imagine we've reversed our train right back to beyond the points again. Here comes the loaded train. He decouples and moves towards us, clearing the points and running round. As he moves forward, we can follow. There he is now, peeling off to the left, back down the cord.
What are you doing up there? Changing ends when you're going round? No. Change ends first? Yeah. Yeah, okay. Right, see you later.
We continue, crossing the West Coast Main Line beneath us.
That's an added boulder. That was an added boulder. Yeah.
Over the M6. All of the track is still there today, by the way, but massively overgrown. There's a great video on YouTube from last summer of someone attempting to walk it all, but it's borderline impassable. Approaching Keele Tunnel.
Dispenser on 150s. Are they? Yeah.
And passing the old Keele station. Approaching the Silverdale Tunnel.
Looks like it, doesn't it? Yeah. Right, we'll tell you. Oh, I know.
And emerging into the colliery yard. Through the loading bunker. A pause for uncoupling. You can see the platforms here of the old Silverdale station on the left and right. Then we move forward the short distance to beyond the points. We're now looking towards Newcastle under Lyme. Then we reverse back round our train. You can see the old Silverdale station building there on the right, also used as a crew facility.
to the side of this bit here. Stretchy part. Yeah, never like that.
We couple up again onto what was the back. Good visibility in a Class 60 cab, isn't it? The train is pulled forward again to clear the bunker. Then pushed back through the bunker for a part load. The train is then pulled forward for a second drop. You can see the fully loaded wagons now, with a neatly squared off top from the coal chute. I think a tight space like this would lend itself to modelling. There's a natural scenic break in Silverdale Tunnel and the track kind of fizzles out in the other direction. This whole section is now a public footpath and the colliery site is now housing and a country park. Still clearing the bunker into Silverdale Tunnel, and once we're clear we resume speed. Back through the old Keele station. This bit of film is actually from the very last train ever to leave Silverdale Colliery in 1998. And back towards Madeley. West Coast Main Line in the background there. That looked like a Holyhead to Birmingham service. We decouple and run round again. And off we go, back down the chord to the down slow of the West Coast Main Line. But where were we going? A major destination from here was Fiddler's Ferry power station on the banks of the Mersey estuary. But two coal-fired power stations were still active in the West Midlands. In Shropshire, on the banks of the River Severn, was Ironbridge, and a few miles south of Stafford, on the Trent, was Rugeley. So let's run up to Basford Hall, turn around and head south. From the start of the 1960s, Rugeley was a one-business town, and its business was power. Its first coal-fired power station, Rugeley A, was commissioned in 1961 after 5 years of construction and became fully operational during 1963. A year later, work started on Rugeley B, and after its commissioning in 1970, both stations would operate alongside each other for nearly 25 years, until A was decommissioned in 1994. Right next door was Lea Hall Colliery, part of the South Staffordshire coalfield. Its shaft was sunk in 1954, and by 1960 it had reached full production. Rugeley A was designed to take a direct conveyor belt feed from the colliery, but the coal was not of high quality and unsuitable for the newer Rugeley B. B received higher grade coal via the on-site rail facility, accessed from a spur off the West Coast Main Line, which ran parallel to the River Trent across the northeast of the site. The 9 massive cooling towers loomed large over the town as it grew quickly. It's an area I know well, and when Lea Hall Pit closed in 1991, it hit the town hard. From then on, all coal was received by train. In the 1980s, the Trent Valley was home to 13 of Britain's 78 power stations and accounted for 25% of the national energy output, the highest concentration in Europe. It was said that the waters of the Trent were noticeably warmer than comparable rivers due to the effects of the cooling towers. It was nicknamed Megawatt Valley and was a conscious decision by the Central Electricity Generating Board in the 60s to move away from smaller municipal power stations in urban areas. As a kid in the 70s and 80s, I remember those old stations dotted around the West Midlands. My first few years on Earth were spent in the shadows of Warsall's cooling towers. We lived over the far back left in this shot, and I vividly remember my dad taking me over Reedswood Park to kick a ball around, but all I wanted to do was peer through the railings and watch the trucks coming and going from the strange building beyond the trees. Ironbridge was rather different, located in the rolling greenery of Shropshire, although the area had a proud industrial heritage. The site was first scoped out by Walsall Corporation in the 1920s as a potential location for a high-output superstation to supply the West Midlands, and in 1932 Ironbridge A was generating. It was joined in 1969 by the far bigger and more powerful Ironbridge B, and in 1981 A was closed. B was designed with its local surroundings very much in mind, a first for a British power station. It couldn't be seen at all from the world-famous Iron Bridge, and the 4 concrete cooling towers had a red pigment added to them to match the colour of the local soil. I guess there's only so much you can do though, as I remember being able to see the towers from the top of my bus to school 16 miles away in Wolverhampton. Shropshire was not a mining county, and all coal arrived at the site by rail, leaving the Wolverhampton to Shrewsbury line between Shifnal and Telford Central, and winding its way around the outskirts of Telford, before entering the power station yard via the Grade 2 listed Albert Edward Bridge across the River Severn, possibly the most picturesque arrival of any MGR train in the country. The rail yard was large, with plenty of space for runarounds, but the transition off the West Coast Main Line in Wolverhampton was restricted and involved convoluted manoeuvres around Wolverhampton Station and nearby freight lines until the Oxley Cord was built in 1983. Only then did Ironbridge have direct rail access to and from collieries to the north. All 4 of the sites we've been looking at today utilise the merry-go-round technology developed in the 1960s, a positive legacy of beaching. It revolutionised coal operations, making them quicker, cheaper and safer. The idea of MGR trains was that a fixed rake of air-braked wagons would be hauled by new diesel locomotives at speeds roughly double those currently in use. The wagons would be loaded at the start of their journey and unloaded at the end automatically, and without the necessity for the train to come to a stop or to shunt its wagons. Using this system, each wagon would be able to make multiple trips every day, so the number of wagons and locomotives required would be dramatically reduced. The wagon was the MGR Hopper, coded HAA under tops, and 2 prototypes were built at Darlington Works in 1964 and 1965 before full production started down the road in Shildon. Over the next 15 years or so, Shildon knocked out nearly 11,000 HAAs, and nearly 500 of the final batch in 1982 coded as HDAs. The HDAs had modified brakes which allowed them to run at a maximum loaded speed of 60 mph instead of the HAA's 45. Combinations of brake modifications and hopper canopies gave rise to other TOPS codes over the years, and some were built specifically for China clay traffic. Following early trials, the full system of merry-go-round working was introduced at Kilkenny Power Station in Scotland in 1966. The results were dramatic, as the 80 HAA wagons employed were able to replace around 1,500 of the old type, transforming the economics of the operation. The shape of the wagon allowed rapid discharge of their load through 3 pairs of hopper doors in the floor, which were unlocked, released and locked automatically by trackside equipment at the power station, nicknamed Daleks. The train needed to be moving at a very slow and consistent speed, and the then newly introduced Class 47 was given the job. Its 47-3 subclass was built for freight, with no train heating and electronic slow-speed control. It was also fitted to some Class 20s and 26s. But the appetite for coal meant a need for longer trains, and that meant a more powerful locomotive. On the 10th anniversary of MGR operations, that loco entered service, in the shape of the thumping, screaming brute, which is the Class 56, my favourite diesel. Not all of the 135-strong fleet of 56s were allocated to coal, but in their first 10 years of service they became synonymous with MGR operations. This 3,250 horsepower Thug was the first of 3 BR Type 5s which would power heavy freight, and especially coal, for the next 3 decades. More powerful than the 47-3s, they could hold an additional 4 loaded MGR wagons. Their Ruston Paxman engine is, for me, the best sound of the British Rail era. You can hear the bass thump a mile away, building to a pounding, screaming crescendo which is properly visceral. But its mechanical theatrics came at a cost. It was a challenge to maintain, and British Rail was soon looking to another design, the Class 58. BR had been feeling the pressure from some of their biggest freight customers over the unreliability of the 56, and also had one eye on the lucrative export market. Their answer was the Doncaster-built Class 58, of similar power but a new modular design. Initially allocated to the coal sector in their entirety, They arrived at the same time as the national miners' strike in 1984-85. North Sea oil and gas exploration was revolutionising the UK energy market, and coal was already in decline before the first walkout at Cortonwood Colliery in South Yorkshire. Coal customers were forced to look elsewhere, and the decline accelerated. 58 drifted into other work. They had a relatively short service life, with the first withdrawal coming in April 1999, and another 14 left service that year. I've always thought they looked rather awkward, and I've never had much love for them. BR only had one more shot at nailing their diesel Type 5, although they didn't know that when the new Class 60 hit the tracks in late 1990. Shaped like a brick and sounding like a truck, the 60 had an 8-cylinder Merleys Blackstone engine, which was simpler and more fuel efficient than those of its predecessors. On paper, it was less powerful than either the 56 or the 58, but exceeded both with power output at the rail, and smashed them out the park with its enormous tractive effort, which was only slightly less than a 56 and 58 combined. It really was a mountain mover. But where the 56 was all fire and brimstone, the 60 had a subdued bass thrum, belying the marine background of its power plant. As a result, I tend to think of the 60s as a bit po-faced and characterless, but their sheer size does give them an imposing track presence, and I am warming to them. All three classes are represented here at Walton, and we'll take a look at them shortly. The final component to the MGR operation was the track itself. A true non-stop MGR facility required a turning loop for the train to change direction, otherwise the loco has to stop and run round its train. Named after their shape, these balloon loops took up a huge amount of space. Imagine turning a train nearly a quarter of a mile long. Newer power stations such as Ratcliffe, West Burton and Cottam all had them, but few, if any, collieries did, and genuine MGR operations were actually rare. None of the four sites we've looked at today had them. Most, if not all, coal trains through Stafford were hauled by locos from Towton, including its outposts at Warrington Arpley and Wigan Springs Branch. It's also worth noting that both Rugeley and Ironbridge received coal from collieries other than Silverdale and Trentham, and Silverdale certainly sent its coal to other parts of the country. This was particularly true in the shadow franchise years, when competition was introduced into coal mining and power generation, as well as rail freight. Hardly any MGR traffic appears in my working timetables of the era. I think they were pathed on a weekly basis, depending on the demands of the power stations, but I'd love to hear from anyone in the know in the comments below. I'm especially curious what this particular movement would have been, hauling then reversing a loaded train through Stafford, maybe a direction change for something from Towton. But enough with the prototypes, this is still a model railway channel, so to close out this episode, we better take a look at what I actually run here at Walton. You couldn't move for HAAs a couple of years ago when both Accurascale and Cavalex brought new models to the market and Hornby re-released their 2003 tooling. The Hornbys got heavily reduced to £15 at the likes of Rails and TMC, the same price as the ancient Hornby tooling I'd been collecting, so saving the cost and effort of wheel and coupler upgrades, I quickly swapped to the newer tooling and hoovered up 34 in short order. I've never looked up which brand is more accurate, and with all due respect to the manufacturers, for coal trains I'm not that fussed. On a train this size, unless the model is obviously naff, I'm going to be price-led. For me, a coal train is all about the visual impact of its length, rather than close-up detail, and the loco hauling it. I've recently started a second rake, which I guess is a bit indulgent, but I want one loaded and one empty so I can run two at the same time in opposite directions. So far I'm up to 21, and these have all been around the £15 mark again. Both rakes add up to over £1,000, so it's still a significant chunk of cash. They're mainly in old rail freight red, but I've mixed in a couple of subsector yellows too, although I don't think the big coal logo is accurate. They all need a blooming good weathering, and I'm keen to recreate an effect I didn't understand until researching for this film. Some collieries used rollers to pull the rake through the loading bunker, and these left horizontal track marks along the sides of each wagon, so it's not simply a case of going nuts with an airbrush full of black paint. I've still got one of the ancient Hornby HAAs, which I use as a track pin hopper. Here it is alongside the latest one. The red framework appears the same, but there's more rivet detail on the new one across the top of the hopper. The inside is very similar, with a bit more strut detail on the sides and more refinement to the floor hinge mechanism. The chassis are very similar, with a bit more printed detail on the new one, but the big difference is the fixed axles. The old ones run on pivoted axles, which no doubt help with tight track work, but looks wrong close up and makes the whole wagon prone to wobble. The wheels are also very small, and some really old versions had plastic ones. The new ones got flexing NEM pockets instead of the big pivoted D couplers, one of the best upgrades. The buffers are metal and sprung, and have a dummy coupling hook on the beam. All in all, a much needed upgrade from Hornby, and second hand at £15 each, these are plenty good enough for me. The completed rake runs on Hunt magnetic couplers of the close variety, although I'm considering swapping over to the pivoting kind, as I think I'm at the limit of their road holding. Haulage is mostly a Cavalex operation, with two of their 56s and one 60, plus one of the EFE rail 58s. Both the grids are Romanian built, with 019 in red stripe and 023 in coal subsector. 019 arrived in the UK at the start of 1977 and ran in BR Blue until it was overhauled at Crew Works in early 1988. It emerged in a fresh livery of rail freight grey with red stripe and red buffers, and it carried these colours for the rest of its life. As such, it's a 100% fit for my layout era and gives me plenty of running. It passed to Transrail under privatisation, was withdrawn in March 1998 and scrapped in November 2003 at Immingham. 023 had a much shorter working life. Arriving in the UK in April 1977 and allocated to Tinsley, it only lasted 16 years in service. In summer 1988 it emerged from Doncaster Works in coal triple grey, but was put in storage 5 years later and withdrawn in December 1993 before being scrapped at Booths in Rotherham in 2004. In its current guise, it covers less than a third of my era and is a prime candidate for renumbering, likely into 56021, which with a swap to oval buffers will give me 100% coverage. These pair are probably my best models. The finesse in the detail, the immersive sound and the drivability all make these an absolute pleasure to run, and I'm really looking forward to future releases. The same can't be said of the Class 58, which is in desperate need of a high-tech bells and whistles rework. Cavalex, I'm looking at you. This is quite a basic and dated model now, and it's not a very reliable runner, although it does sound good on the House sound file I've got here. I had an attempt at weathering this a while ago and made quite a balls up of it, to be honest, but cleaning it all off again kind of gave me an acceptable effect. I made a point of touching in some red on the sole bar to show where the black paint of the subsector livery had flaked off, revealing the old red stripe livery underneath. 018 was added to Toten stock in October 1984 in red stripe livery. In summer 1988 it was repainted into coal triple grey and received the name High Marnham Power Station. Most 58s were named after either power stations or collieries. It was debranded at the start of 1994 and passed into the ownership of Mainline, gaining their black and blue logo later the same year. It was withdrawn in December 1999, but found further work with various classmates in France, working on TGV construction contracts from 2005. It was scrapped there in 2023. 58s never seemed as common at Stafford as 56s and 60s, so I never see myself running a large fleet of them here at Walton. They're far from my favourite loco, but I do like having 58s here. I just like a better model. Back to the blue chip stuff, and 60061 Alexander Graham Bell is one of two Cavalex tugs which arrived in the summer. 061 was accepted to Towton in June 1991, allocated 2 and liveried 4 coal operations. Pictures online suggest it was outposted at Arpley and Springs Branch for workings around the northwest and northern sections of the West Coast Main Line. On privatisation, it was assigned to Transrail, but retained its coal diamonds until late 1995. Under Transrail, it could be seen working out of Peak Forest on RMC aggregates trains, so this model also gives me 100% availability, albeit on different trains. It wore the Transrail livery for the rest of its working life, bouncing in and out of storage several times in the late 2000s. It entered storage for good in August 2009 and is currently rotting away in the yard at Brush Loughborough with several classmates and Class 92 cousins. I'll definitely add more of these models, and they've certainly warmed my heart towards the real thing, even during the creation of this episode. Like their Cavalex stablemates, they look and sound fantastic and are an absolute joy to drive. I'm taking a mid-season break now, but I'll be back with episode 5 in February next year. Until then, thanks so much for watching. Have a great Christmas and New Year. See you soon. Bye bye.